You know that moment when you're scrolling through social media and you see someone your age posting about their latest vacation to Europe, their brand new Tesla, or their gorgeous downtown apartment, and you can't help but wonder how they afford it all. Maybe you start questioning whether you're falling behind financially, whether everyone else has figured out some secret to building wealth that you missed. Well, what if I told you that there's a specific net worth number that puts you ahead of 9 out of 10 Americans, and it's probably not what you think it is? My name is Alex, and I spent over a decade in investment banking watching wealthy clients make and lose fortunes before retiring in my mid-30s to study finance and wealth creation. These days, I mentor people on building real wealth, and I can tell you that most people have absolutely no idea where they actually stand financially compared to their peers. They're making financial decisions based on assumptions that are completely wrong. If you've ever wondered whether you're doing better or worse than the average person when it comes to money, or if you want to understand what it really takes to get ahead financially in this country, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, because by the end of this video, you're going to have a crystal clear picture of exactly where you stand and what you need to do to get into that top 10%. Now, before we dive into the specific numbers that will probably shock you, let me ask you something. When you think about being wealthy or financially successful, what comes to mind? Do you picture someone with millions in the bank, driving exotic cars and living in mansion? Or maybe you think about those Instagram influencers flashing designer handbags and first-class plane tickets. The truth is, real wealth looks nothing like what you see on social media, and the number that puts you ahead of 90% of Americans is far more achievable than most people realize. Here's what's fascinating about wealth in America. We're constantly bombarded with images of extreme luxury and lifestyle inflation, which creates this distorted view of what financial success actually looks like. Meanwhile, the vast majority of people have no real understanding of where they stand compared to their neighbors, their coworkers, or even their own family members. This lack of awareness leads to terrible financial decisions and a constant feeling of being behind, even when you might actually be doing better than you think. The Federal Reserve conducts a comprehensive survey every 3 years that tracks the wealth of American families, and the results reveal some pretty eye-opening truths about where people actually stand financially. When we talk about net worth, we're simply looking at what you own minus what you owe. Add up the value of your house, your cars, your bank accounts, your retirement savings, and any other assets, then subtract your mortgage, credit card debt, student loans, and other debts. What's left is your net worth. According to the most recent data, the net worth that puts you ahead of 90% of Americans is approximately $400,000. Now, before you either celebrate or panic, depending on where you currently stand, let me break down what this number actually means and why it's both more achievable and more challenging than it appears on the surface. $400,000 might sound like an enormous amount of money if you're just starting your career, or if you're currently struggling with debt. But here's the thing that most people don't understand about wealth building. The vast majority of that $400,000 doesn't come from earning a massive salary or hitting the lottery. It comes from the slow, methodical accumulation of assets over time, combined with the power of compound growth. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical person with $400,000 in net worth actually looks like, because it's probably not what you're imagining. They're not driving around in Lamborghinis or living in penthouse apartments. More often than not, they're driving a reliable used car that they paid off years ago, living in a modest home that they've owned for a decade or more, and consistently putting money into their retirement accounts without making a big show of it. Right? This is where things get really interesting from a psychological perspective. The people who reach this level of wealth typically develop what I call invisible wealth habits. They're not flashy spenders. They're not trying to impress anyone with their lifestyle. Instead, they've quietly built systems that allow their money to grow while they focus on other things in life. Think about it this way. If you start saving and investing just $500 per month at age 25, and you earn a reasonable 8% annual return, you'll have over $400,000 by age 50. That's 25 years of putting away what amounts to about $16 per day. the price of a couple of coffee drinks or one lunch out. But here's where most people get tripped up, and it's something I see constantly when mentoring clients. They focus entirely on the income side of the equation while completely ignoring the spending side. They think they need to earn more money to build wealth, when in reality they need to keep more of the money they're already earning. The average household in America spends every dollar they make, regardless of whether they earn $50,000 or $500,000 per year. This phenomenon is called lifestyle inflation, and it's the single biggest obstacle to building wealth. As people's income increases, their spending increases right along with it, leaving them no better off financially than when they were earning less. I remember working with a client who was earning over $200,000 per year, but had less than $10,000 in savings. He couldn't understand why he felt financially stressed when he was making more money than most people could ever dream of earning. The problem wasn't his income. The problem was that his lifestyle had expanded to consume every penny of that income, leaving him just as vulnerable to financial emergencies as someone making a fraction of his salary. This is why understanding the $400,000 milestone is so important. It forces you to think about wealth in terms of what you keep and grow, not just what you earn. Someone earning $60,000 per year who saves and invests 20% of their income will build more wealth over time than someone earning $100,000 per year who saves nothing. The path to $400,000 in net worth isn't particularly complicated, but it does require discipline and time. Most people who reach this level follow a surprisingly similar playbook. They live below their means. They automate their savings so they never have to think about it. They invest in simple, diversified portfolios rather than trying to pick individual stocks. And most importantly, they stay consistent over long periods of time. What's really fascinating is how this net worth milestone changes your relationship with money and risk. When you have $400,000 in assets, you're no longer living paycheck to paycheck or stressed about every unexpected expense. You have options. You can take calculated risks with your career because you have a financial cushion. You can invest in opportunities that might take years to pay off because you're not desperate for immediate returns. But here's something that might surprise you about people who reach this level of wealth. They often don't feel wealthy at all. This is because they've developed the habits and mindset that got them to $400,000 in the first place, which means they're still living relatively modestly and thinking about long-term financial security rather than immediate gratification. The psychological impact of crossing this threshold is profound, even if it happens gradually over many years. You start making decisions from a position of strength rather than desperation. You're not taking the first job offer that comes along because you need the money. You're not staying in situations you hate because leaving feels too financially risky. This shift in mindset affects every aspect of how you approach money. Instead of asking whether you can afford something, you start asking whether it's worth it. Instead of being reactive to financial challenges, you become proactive about opportunities. And perhaps most importantly, you stop seeing money as something that disappears from your life and start understanding it as a tool that can create more money. Now let's talk about what this $400,000 milestone looks like broken down by age, because the timeline matters enormously when we're discussing wealth building. If you're 25 years old with $400,000 in net worth, you're basically a financial unicorn. You've either inherited money, sold a business, or made some extraordinary financial moves that put you decades ahead of your peers. But if you're 65 with $400,000, you might actually be behind where you should be for a comfortable retirement. The key insight here is that wealth building is deeply connected to time, and the earlier you start, the less money you need to contribute each month to reach significant milestones. This is where compound interest becomes your best friend or your worst enemy, depending on whether you're investing or carrying debt. Every year you delay starting to build wealth makes the path significantly more difficult. Let me share something that will probably make you rethink how you view your current financial situation. The median net worth for Americans in their 30s is less than $8,000. That means half of all people in their 30s have less than $8,000 in total wealth. When you put that in perspective, even having $50,000 in net worth in your 30s puts you well ahead of most of your peers. But here's where things get really interesting from a behavioral economics standpoint. Most people dramatically overestimate how wealthy their friends and neighbors actually are. This happens because we're constantly exposed to people's highlight reels, rather than their financial reality. Social media has made this problem exponentially worse because people share their best moments while hiding their struggles. The person posting photos from their expensive vacation might have put the entire trip on credit cards. The neighbor with the brand new luxury car might be making payments that consume 30% of their income. The coworker who always seems to have the latest gadgets might have zero savings and be living completely paycheck to paycheck. We see the lifestyle, but we never see the balance sheet. This is why understanding where you actually stand compared to real data rather than social media impressions is so crucial for making good financial decisions. When you realize that having even $100,000 in net worth puts you ahead of roughly 70% of Americans, it changes how you think about your financial progress and what's actually achievable. The path from 0 to 400,000 isn't linear, and that's something most people don't expect. The first 50,000 is brutally difficult because you're fighting against every spending impulse while trying to build new habits. You're saving money that could be going toward things you want right now, and the account balance feels like it's barely moving despite your efforts. But something magical happens once you hit that first major milestone. Maybe it's 50,000, maybe it's 100,000, but there's a psychological tipping point where you start seeing your money as a tool rather than just something you spend. The account balance becomes large enough that the monthly growth from investments starts to feel meaningful rather than insignificant. This is when people typically experience what I call the wealth-building acceleration phase. They've developed the discipline to save consistently, they understand how investing works, and they're starting to see real progress. The second 100,000 comes faster than the first, and the third comes faster than the second. By the time they're approaching that 400,000 milestone, the momentum feels almost inevitable. What's particularly fascinating is how people's spending habits evolve during this journey. In the early stages, they might feel deprived because they're constantly saying no to things they want in order to save money. But as their wealth grows, they often discover that they don't actually want most of the things they thought they needed. The psychological security that comes from having substantial savings often reduces the desire for material possessions. I've seen this pattern repeatedly with clients over the years. Someone will start their wealth-building journey convinced they need to earn more money to afford the lifestyle they want. But after consistently saving and investing for several years, they realize their definition of a good lifestyle has completely changed. They value financial freedom more than expensive toys, and they've learned to find satisfaction in experiences and relationships rather than accumulating stuff. The 400,000 milestone represents more than just a number in your bank account. It represents a fundamental shift in how you relate to money, work, and life choices. You're no longer trapped by your financial circumstances, which means you can make decisions based on what you actually want, rather than what you feel forced to accept. This level of wealth also opens up investment opportunities that aren't available to people with smaller amounts of money. You can invest in real estate, whether that's rental properties or real estate investment trusts. You can build a more sophisticated portfolio with international exposure and alternative investments. You can take advantage of market downturns by having cash available when everyone else is panicking. But perhaps most importantly, you can afford to be patient with your investments and your career. You're not forced to chase get-rich-quick schemes because you have the luxury of letting compound interest work over long time periods. You can focus on building sustainable wealth rather than trying to hit home runs that might strike out. The psychological benefits extend beyond just financial security. People who reach this level of wealth report sleeping better, having less stress in their relationships, and feeling more confident in their professional lives. Money might not buy happiness directly, but it certainly eliminates many of the sources of anxiety and stress that prevent happiness. Here's something that might challenge your assumptions about what it takes to reach this milestone. The vast majority of people who accumulate 400,000 in net worth are not high earners in the traditional sense. They're not doctors or lawyers or investment bankers. They're teachers, government employees, small business owners, and skilled tradespeople who simply understood the importance of living below their means and investing consistently over time. What's really striking is how these wealth builders approach major purchases completely differently than the average person. When someone with substantial net worth considers buying a car, they're not thinking about monthly payments or how impressive it looks in the driveway. They're calculating the total cost of ownership and asking whether that money would be better invested elsewhere. They understand that every dollar spent on a depreciating asset is a dollar that can't compound and grow over time. This mindset shift becomes even more apparent when you look at housing decisions. The typical American views their home as their biggest investment, but people who reach $400,000 in net worth understand that your primary residence is actually a consumption expense, not an investment. Yes, it might appreciate over time, but it's also costing you property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and opportunity cost on the down payment you made. I worked with a couple who were debating whether to upgrade from their perfectly functional 3-bedroom house to a 5-bedroom McMansion. On paper, they could afford the larger mortgage payment, but when we calculated the opportunity cost of the additional money they'd be tying up in housing, the numbers were staggering. The extra $200,000 they'd spend on the bigger house could grow to over $1 million in their investment accounts over 20 years. Suddenly, those extra bedrooms didn't seem quite as appealing. This is where understanding net worth becomes crucial for making smart financial decisions. It's not about how much you can borrow or what monthly payment you can squeeze into your budget. It's about understanding the true cost of every financial choice you make and how those choices impact your long-term wealth-building trajectory. The $400,000 milestone also represents a shift in how you think about income and career decisions. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, you're essentially trapped in whatever job you currently have because you can't afford any disruption to your income stream. But when you have substantial assets backing you up, you can afford to be more strategic about your career moves. Maybe that means taking a temporary pay cut to switch to an industry with better long-term prospects. Maybe it means starting a side business that could eventually replace your primary income. Or maybe it simply means negotiating more aggressively for salary increases because you're not desperate to keep any particular job at any cost. I remember a client who worked in corporate accounting and absolutely hated his job, but felt trapped because he had a mortgage and family to support. After 5 years of consistent saving and investing, he had built up enough wealth that he could afford to take some risks. He started a consulting practice on weekends, and within 2 years he was earning more from consulting than from his corporate job. The financial cushion gave him the confidence to make a career change that dramatically improved both his income and his quality of life. What's fascinating is how this level of wealth affects your relationship with money on a day-to-day basis. Small financial decisions that used to require careful consideration become largely irrelevant. You're not choosing between name brand and generic groceries because you're worried about your bank balance. You're making those choices based on preference rather than financial necessity. This mental freedom is incredibly liberating because it eliminates what psychologists call decision fatigue. When you're not constantly calculating whether you can afford every small purchase, you free up mental energy for more important decisions. You can focus on growing your wealth rather than just managing your cash flow. But here's something that catches many people off guard as they approach this milestone. The habits that got you to $400,000 are often completely different from the habits you need to grow beyond $400,000. In the accumulation phase, you're focused on saving as much as possible and investing in simple, low-cost index funds. But once you have substantial assets, you need to start thinking about tax optimization, estate planning, and more sophisticated investment strategies. This is where many people plateau because they don't adapt their approach as their financial situation evolves. They keep using the same strategies that worked when they had $50,000 in assets, not realizing that different levels of wealth require different approaches to management and growth. The tax implications alone become much more significant once you cross certain wealth thresholds. You might need to consider Roth conversions, tax loss harvesting, or asset location strategies that weren't relevant when you had smaller amounts invested. You might benefit from working with a fee-only financial advisor or tax professional who can help optimize your approach. Real estate often becomes a much more attractive option at this level as well. When you have substantial liquid assets, you can consider investment properties without over-leveraging yourself. You might buy a rental property with cash and then gradually take out mortgages to free up capital for other investments. Or you might invest in real estate investment trusts to get exposure to the real estate market without the hassles of direct ownership. The key insight is that wealth-building strategies need to evolve as your wealth grows. What works for getting from 0 to 100,000 might not be optimal for getting from 400,000 to 1 million. This is why continuous financial education becomes so important as you progress along the wealth-building journey. One of the most surprising aspects of reaching this level of wealth is how it changes your perspective on risk and opportunity. When you're struggling financially, every decision feels high stakes because you can't afford to make mistakes. But when you have substantial assets, you can afford to take calculated risks that might have enormous upside potential. Maybe that means investing in individual stocks or sector-specific funds that you wouldn't have considered when you had less money to work with. Maybe it means starting a business or investing in someone else's business. Or maybe it simply means being more aggressive with your asset allocation because you have a longer time horizon and can weather short-term volatility. This ability to think long-term and take calculated risks is one of the biggest advantages of having substantial wealth. You're not forced to make decisions based on immediate financial pressure, which means you can optimize for long-term outcomes rather than short-term survival. The social dynamics around money also change significantly once you reach this level. You might find that your priorities and values have shifted in ways that affect your relationships. Friends who are still focused on lifestyle spending might not understand why you drive an older car or live in a modest house despite having substantial assets. Family members might assume you should pick up the check at every restaurant because you're perceived as wealthy. These relationship dynamics can be challenging to navigate because money often reveals fundamental differences in values and priorities. The discipline and delayed gratification that allowed you to build wealth might put you at odds with people who prioritize immediate enjoyment over long-term security. But you might also find yourself connecting with other people who share similar financial values and goals. There's something powerful about surrounding yourself with people who understand the importance of building wealth and can support you in making decisions that prioritize long-term financial health over short-term gratification. The 400,000 milestone also represents a level of wealth where you can start thinking seriously about financial independence and early retirement. While 400,000 alone might not be enough to retire completely, it's certainly enough to start planning for a future where work becomes optional rather than mandatory. Using the traditional 4% withdrawal rule, 400,000 could generate about $16,000 per year in retirement income. That's not enough to live on for most people, but it's a substantial foundation that could cover many basic expenses. Combined with Social Security and other income sources, it might be enough to support a modest retirement lifestyle. More importantly, once you reach this level of wealth, the momentum toward complete financial independence accelerates dramatically. The investment returns on 400,000 start to become meaningful in absolute terms. An 8% return generates $32,000 in growth, which is more than many people save in an entire year. This is when wealth building starts to feel less like swimming against the current and more like riding a wave. The money you've already accumulated starts doing significant work on your behalf, which means you don't have to save as aggressively to continue making progress toward your ultimate financial goals. The psychological impact of this acceleration phase cannot be overstated. After years of disciplined saving and modest investment returns, you suddenly start seeing your net worth grow by amounts that previously took you months or years to save. It's incredibly motivating and reinforces all the sacrifices you made during the earlier phases of wealth building. This momentum also creates what I call the wealth building flywheel effect. As you see your investments growing, you become even more motivated to optimize your financial strategies. You might increase your savings rate, research better investment options, or look for ways to reduce taxes and fees. Each improvement accelerates your progress, which motivates further improvements. So there you have it. $400,000 in net worth puts you ahead of 90% of Americans, and frankly, it's more achievable than most people realize. It's not about earning a massive salary or getting lucky with some investment. It's about developing the right habits, staying consistent over time, and understanding that real wealth is built slowly and quietly rather than through flashy get-rich-quick schemes. The most important thing to remember is that this journey isn't about deprivation or living like a monk. It's about being intentional with your money and making decisions that align with your long-term goals rather than your immediate impulses. Every dollar you save and invest today is a dollar that can work for you for decades to come. If you're nowhere near $400,000 right now, don't let that discourage you. Remember, the median American in their 30s has less than $8,000 in net worth. Even getting to $50,000 puts you well ahead of most people your age. The key is to start where you are and begin building the habits that will compound over time. Whether you're just starting your wealth-building journey or you're already well on your way to that 400,000 milestone, the principles remain the same. Live below your means, invest consistently, and stay focused on the long-term picture rather than getting distracted by short-term market noise or lifestyle temptations. Your future self is counting on the decisions you make today. Start building that foundation now, because 20 years from today, you'll either wish you had started or you'll be grateful that you did.